Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. You can find links to all of the stories we're talking about here today by visiting breakpoint.org, where you'll also find commentaries and resources every day to help you live and think like a Christian in today's culture. John, you may have noticed this week in all of our video exchanges, I was wearing a jacket, and that's because we had temperatures down here in Florida in the mid-40s, which is pretty cold for early December. And I just read in the South Florida Sun-Sentinel that it was cold enough in some places to cause the iguanas to fall from the trees again. It's an annual occurrence for us. It's one we cherish. It's like a Christmas tradition. And as I understand it, it's actually one of the items on a newly circulated Breakpoint bingo game that we heard about on staff this week.
Who said social media is not good for stuff? Where else would you get? By the way, the Breakpoint bingo it's way more redemptive and Christian than the presidential debate drinking game. Where somebody,
Right.
one of the presidential candidates says something that you expect, and then you have to take a drink. We don't do that here at the Colson Center. So instead, either I mention TSA or you mention C.S. Lewis, or either one of us mentions falling iguanas, and
Right.
and then that's one of the items on the bingo card.
I think
And
it was
it's good.
weird stuff happening in Florida. For instance, falling iguanas. That was
Man,
how it was phrased.
everybody would win this bingo game if we just talked about weird stuff happening in Florida. I mean, that's just like, that could be a weekly occurrence.
Right.
That's a daily occurrence. People don't. If people had access to our email exchanges among our editorial team at the Colson Center, the number of Florida man stories that get sent around is just really stunning. I got to ask you this though: are the Florida stories more directly centered in any particular part of the country? Because a few weeks ago, I actually did one of the only live events I've done all year, which was speak at a pregnancy resource center there in Gainesville, and had flown into Jacksonville to see some friends and drove over. And that drive between Jacksonville and Gainesville, north central Florida, I guess somewhere around there, I thought this is where most of these stories come from, is from that region. Am I right?
You know what?
on
I
that?
don't think so. I think north central Florida is like an extension of Georgia, and most of the crazy stories, like people eating bath salts and then eating people's faces off. Murder scenes where there's reptiles in bathtubs and monkeys in sailor suits, stuff like that. Those are all real, by the way. Those are usually from like Miami-Dade, Palm Beach area.
So where was the one that my favorite one of all time was man arrested for assault after throwing alligator through a drive-through window?
I think that was on my coast. I think that was on the
your
west
coast?
side.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That was a classic headline. You just think, and it really happened. It really happened.
John, you mentioned a minute ago the drinking games for the presidential debate, and it seems like normally at this time of year, every 4 years, this sort of thing would be over. But this year, it's really not over. It's sort of dragged on into the Christmas season. And we have the latest entry is this 45-minute video posted by the president a couple of days ago, reiterating a ton of the initial claims that he made about how the election was rigged and how he says this may be his most important speech ever. He repeated this long list of examples that supposedly show the election was stolen. And of course, most of these have been in some degree adjudicated in courts around the country at this point and not really gotten any traction. In fact, most of them have been dismissed in these swing states, some by Trump appointees to the bench. So let's talk about this, because it is one of those news items that just takes up all the oxygen in the room, and it's impossible not to talk about it. But it's also contentious and raises a lot of emotions and ruined a lot of Thanksgiving dinners, I'm told. So what do we think about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a hard thing because people realize that there was an awful lot at stake in this election, and both sides really felt it. And when you go in with the sort of rhetoric that was taken into an election like this, and the amount of weight that's put on the political process, you might remember a couple weeks ago we talked about this idea that we've long talked about at the Colson Center, that politics is downstream from culture, and yet really, if you just looked at face value where our culture is right now, politics is at the center of culture, and that says a lot about our culture. is that all the most important things that are happening right now have political ramifications. And what's the political debates that we're having are dealing with the depths of what it means to be human, are dealing with issues of just incredible consequence. And so going in, you had those sorts of things at stake, and then it's very easy then to ratchet that up rhetorically 3 or 4 or 5 degrees. So, going in, expectations of a fraud taking place. And of course, the thing is when you're talking about elections on this scale, you're going to be able to find fraud. There has been fraud throughout American history, sometimes worse than others.
And that's what Trump's own Attorney General said a few days ago, Bill Barr. He didn't deny that there was fraud here and there. There's fraud in every election. He denied that there was anything that could have possibly changed the result of the election.
Right. But what you had then, again, going into the election, is an example of just how much public trust has kind of eroded. Where, we had just repeated headlines about, Trump refuses to say whether he'll agree to a peaceful transition, and, can we trust this election at all, from people on the right. And so all of this was going in and framing it, and the stakes are as high as they possibly can be in so many people's minds. And so it feeds all of this and makes this really believable. The problem we have here is that, and let me just also add too, it doesn't help that, again, one side is saying the election is stolen and not being able to offer the sort of, evidence and proof that shows that. And on the other hand, you've got people saying no fraud took place, which people don't believe either. And it's kind of the headline leading, the story before any sort of serious investigation or conclusions have really been allowed to be drawn out. The thing is there's a legal process for this. The legal process is actually happening. Mm-hmm. The legal process happened because of Florida, if we can mention that again, back in 2000, right? And it went on until January. And okay, that's what this is. But the rhetoric happening around both sides of this is making it worse.
Well, and that's why we're talking about this, though, because the rhetoric is significant. It is significant when people are convinced by, say, a president that that the elections that we hold as this country are not trustworthy. You mentioned the 2000 election. Back in 2000, Chuck Colson did a breakpoint where he pointed out the importance of coming to a peaceful conclusion to this sort of thing, because it maintains confidence in our system of government, in he called it the experiment in liberty, the grandest experiment in liberty ever undertaken. And he said that would be undermined if this sort of wrangling continued, if the protests and outrage continued. And much the same thing applies in this case.
And for the record, they did in 2000. I mean, the claim, for example,
until the Supreme Court dealt with it.
No, right? it lasted beyond that too. I mean, I'm old enough, to remember how deeply into President Bush's tenure he was accused of stealing the election, or the Supreme Court was accused of stealing the election, because it had so many conservative appointees on it. It happened deep. In fact, there was the legitimacy of his presidency was questioned basically until 9/11. 9/11 was a disruptive event, obviously in all kinds of ways, but that was one of the ways. But at the time, and I want to post this, we'll post this at breakpoint.org, Chuck worried where this sort of thing would lead.
Right.
And he hoped that it would not lead to where we are, and it has led to where we are. Because what you have, those who are now claiming that the election was stolen have had an opportunity to present why they think the election was stolen, and it has not been presented. And so what's becoming obvious is the assumption that it's just impossible. In other words, the evidence is serving a pre-gone conclusion that it's just impossible that the president would have lost. But that doesn't. And that they stole it. And the problem with the claim right now, as far as we can see, and again, it's still being adjudicated, and I'm all for, and I think the president should be, and I think the press should all be for letting this stuff be adjudicated. But the problem with that conclusion is they that stole it now include both Democratic folks and the governor of Arizona and the governor of Georgia. And so now it's just people that were quote unquote on our side or not on our side, and how do we deal with all of this? And then of course there's the the other issue of basically well, I'll give you one more practical thing that makes this a very difficult claim, is that the more and more House seats there are that are decided, the fewer of those are actually being flipped. And so more and more of these ballots, more and more voters are being shown to have split their votes, going Democrat at the top of the ticket and going Republican down ticket. And again, I'm not saying that there's no shenanigans anywhere or there's no foul play. I think people smell some things smell fishy to plenty of people, and these things need to be looked at and dealt with, and they should be fully dealt with. But it's the foregone conclusion up front that's making the rhetoric irresponsible. And this is something that in 2000 we saw coming from media pundits. We saw it coming from critics of then President Bush, but you didn't see it from the White House itself.
Right.
You didn't, and that's what makes this one different. And of course, but let me throw this in too, Shane, because I spent a year in Jamaica after college. That should be on our bingo card too, although I don't talk about that nearly as much. I coached basketball in Jamaica.
You've never talked about your year in Jamaica. But I assume it was because there was all kinds of, experimentation with your identity and so forth going on there. So I don't want to bring it up.
Not even a little bit. I was hosting mission teams down there, having a great time, playing a lot of basketball. The two things that were really interesting, were Fidel Castro visited the island, and I went to hear him speak, and I was 20 yards from him. I could have hit him with a rock. But there were snipers on the building, so I decided not to.
There's a lot of Cubans here in Florida who would ask, why didn't you hit him with a rock?
And they actually, yeah. Well, the reason goes into my second thing, which happened, which was an election during that year. And I remember, I didn't work for the Peace Corps, but there were a lot of people that I got to know who did, and they were told to stay at home for a week. 2 weeks, the week prior and the week afterwards. All Americans were told, to cut back on, how much you walked around town. And I remember that election because I remember for about a month out seeing, as I walked through downtown square in Montego Bay, St. George's Square, armed guards, National Guards, AK-47s. And I had never seen that on the streets of America, obviously. And then the election came and went and 2 people were murdered. And it was hailed as an enormous success. Like it was the most peaceful election they'd had there in years.
Wow.
Isn't that an amazing thing? And I'm really struck here in the middle, Shane, between having great concern by, again, an election from a much bigger perspective that no matter how it went, the number of people unwilling to be governed, people questioning it, and having ground to question the information that they get from all sides, because who knows, who's telling us what. But at the same time thinking, you know what? Despite the breathless hysteria about there not being a peaceful transition, despite claims that an election was rigged and stolen, despite the fact that there was so much contentiousness and a split media and big tech playing into this with Twitter, and that's a whole nother part of this story. And despite all of that, we had an election, and the results are being adjudicated. And you know what? The transition process has begun, and there'll be an inauguration in January, and nobody got shot.
Yeah.
There's something about the strength and the resilience.
Don't jinx it, John. Don't jinx it. We're not to January yet.
There's something about the strength, and my point is there's something about the strength and the resiliency of the system.
Yes.
That it can handle these things. Now, when people say this is the most consequential election of our lifetime, it's easy to say, well, everybody says that. It's never true. sometime it's going to be true. I
Right.
mean, one of these elections is going to be it, or when it's like, I don't think our culture can handle much more moral breakdown, and everyone's like, well, it was worse, but at
personally,
some level, it's the
I would
straw that breaks the
nominate
camel's back.
I would nominate Lincoln's first election as probably the most consequential for the nation, but who knows what's going to happen in the future. But your point is exactly right, John. We talk about every time there's an election here, you hear media figures talk about the peaceful transition of power and how that's such a good and treasured thing here in America. And you only need to travel the world, like you said, to realize why we treasure that the way we do. And that's why we're talking about this, because threats to the legitimacy of the election and confidence in our system to deliver legitimate results they undermine that. They chip away at that. And it's great how resilient the monument of American peaceful elections is, but every monument has a breaking point, and we can't keep chipping away at it like this and declaring every election that doesn't go our way illegitimate. But eventually something's going to happen. And that's why we're talking about this. Why it matters.
It does. I want to add one more quick thing, and I risk doing it just because it's not as developed of a thought. But I've been thinking about this literally for months, and I know it because it's Colorado, and I haven't mowed my grass, probably for 2.5 months, and because you don't have to, once it gets to a certain level, it's not like Florida where you have to mow it all year round.
You got to mow the snow.
That's right. We've already had plenty of that. And I remember first really thinking through this when I was mowing my grass. So that tells you how long I've been thinking about this. And that is, I was tempted to make election predictions back in whenever that would have been, September or probably August, actually. And, joking, which at that time, who could have predicted? And who could have predicted this? And even the way the states came down, even how Florida landed and Georgia. I mean, who would have predicted any of this stuff, right? But you know what I am predicting still, and I was going to predict then, is that there's going to be a whole lot of people really regretful of particularly brothers and sisters in Christ who are on the same side of truth and goodness and beauty and justice, but allowed this election to break up friendships. I'm literally heartbroken over this.
Yeah. With
some of our my good friends, some of our contacts, I get emails. I got three this week, demanding that I speak out on something, and I just don't find any of this stuff very helpful. I don't need to mark my territory. This is where I stand on these things. And I think that the demand to do that has broken up so many relationships, and I think that's we're gonna get on the other side of this 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I think in particular when we start looking at going back to maybe some of the pressures on Christian conviction and institutions and so on, and we're going to realize we're in the foxhole again beside people that we have kicked out or we think should be kicked out, and it's going to be hard. And also just on a personal level, Christian friendships are some of the greatest gifts God has given us, and I think some of us are going to really regret allowing those to be squandered during this time.
Yeah. We've got to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, one of the stories that we covered earlier this week on Breakpoint was a story that's been mentioned in a couple different outlets, but the one we really went with was The Atlantic. And the question they raise is, will there be a COVID baby bust? And we're really early in the process at this point because we're not even 9 months into the pandemic. We're coming up right about on that. So decisions that people have made about whether or not to have kids won't really show up until the new year. And then we'll see the hard numbers start coming in. But there have been a number of projections, some of them based on prior economic disruptions like 2008, some of them based on really interesting metrics like the number of people who search pregnancy-related terms on Google. Well, the numbers are in there, and those sorts of searches are down. And historic indicators suggest that we can expect something like a 15% drop in birth rates, which doesn't make sense to me since so many people have been, stuck at home for so long. When there's a giant blackout on, like the East Coast happened a little while ago, there was a baby bust or baby boom 9 months after that. But in this case, it seems like the economic pressures are pushing in the opposite direction. The reason this is a story, and what you said on Breakpoint that I loved, was that it's like, removing 15% more on the fertility rate is like, at this point, taking another handful of dirt out of the Grand Canyon, because America's fertility rate is at a historic low already, well below replacement rate, which is the number of children that every woman has to have on average, not every woman, but on average over her lifetime in order to replace the population, the people who are dying. We're at 1.7 thereabouts, and it's going to continue to drop. And it raises the question of whether this really mirrors what happened in past economic disruptions, like in the Great Depression, or in world wars, or in the 1970s energy crisis, or whether something's changed, whether we have ceased to value children as a culture to such a degree that they are now at the bottom of our priority list. And we cannot. The question is, will we expect a rebound after this? Much less any kind of new baby boom to compensate for all of the people who just won't be here because of our declining fertility rate.
Well, I was among, a few that probably made some jokes the opposite direction, that there's going to be a COVID baby boom, and I think they were going to call this generation the quarantiners or something like that. And, this was all
quarantines, when they hit their teens.
When they hit their teens,
quarantines,
right. Yeah. So, I mean, you would think at face value, there's going to be more babies just because of, people are locked at home together and, that's what happens. But if it does turn out to be a baby bust, like so many people now are predicting, and I mean the amount here is pretty significant. I mean, overall,
300,000 to 500,000 was
500,000 fewer babies than you would expect in 2021. I mean, that's real. That's real numbers. That's real. That's a real amount of people. But it's going to be what we have seen in so many other areas of COVID, where COVID hasn't created the problem, COVID's revealed and worsened the problem. It's a catalyst to something that's already in place. I have coined the term, and I'm claiming it, pre-existing conditions, right? And we know there's comorbidities when it comes to the physical well-being of people who contract COVID. There's also comorbidities when it comes to societies and what we see kind of emerge in societies. And these comorbidities, this has been in place for a long time. I have been talking about this to students as a reflection of what you can read into the health and well-being of a culture. Chuck Colson used to say this a lot, like you can see a lot about whether a culture has a future by its ability to delay gratification. The health and well-being of a culture and a society, and by the way, it's the same as for an individual or a family. If you're able to say no now because there's something bigger and better that you want to wait for, then that's a good sign. It means you're, in the words of Patiram Sorokin, an early sociologist at Harvard, you're an idealistic society. You're living out of the ideals.
I would call that low time preference.
Low time.
You've never heard of that? Yeah,
No.
high time preferences, you want instant gratification. Low time preferences, you're willing to defer gratification.
So Sorokin was one of the early ones, and there were some others that basically identify cultures as either sensate or ideational. And ideational cultures are living for ideals. Think about our Constitution or the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal. That wasn't the reality of a culture. It's an ideal that we're shooting for that made certain things inevitable. You can think about the caliphate, Islamic cultures living for a caliphate. They're living for an ideal. That's very different than eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That, get the goods while you can. He who dies with the most toys wins.
Yeah.
That sort of stuff that defines so much of Western culture. And one of the things that these folks would point to as being an indicator of this, and you know this as a dad, Shane, nothing makes you think about the future like your kids.
Right.
There's a difference between being a good, well-behaved single guy and being a dad. I mean, it's not even like you're crazy and jumping off, ramps with your skateboard at age 40 if you're single. I mean, like you're actually living for the future. When I got 3 daughters, I think about what it's going to cost to pay for college and pay for weddings and how to balance that out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about the future. Now I've got a son, and I'm thinking, how quickly can I get him to work, and make some money? Actually, I'm doing that with my daughters too. But it reveals an awful lot about culture, not just about how we perceive children itself, although that's a key thing. And you've talked a lot about that, which is whether kids are core to what it means to be human, core to what it means to be married, that inherent relationship, whether we see kids as a decoration on adulting
or a consumer choice that we either make or don't make.
Right, which drives so much of the reproductive technologies that we talk so much about here, because it reflects that deeper worldview. But the other part of this is it really does point to the health of a nation. Mm-hmm. By the way, that 1.7 fertility rate that you mentioned, some people that have written on this, and I'm thinking of Bernard Lewis in particular, who was one of the earliest conservative thinkers on this. He thinks 1.7 is the rate of no return. Like, in other words, once you get to a fertility rate of 1.7, there's not enough people for enough people to marry.
Right.
And that only gets worsened if there's a gender imbalance like you see in China or India or even increasingly in the United States with a sex-selective abortion.
Look long-term. And the demography, it's hard to believe this because you go to these countries and you're like, oh, well, this still looks fine. There's plenty of people on the streets. But the way demographers look at these things is in the long term. And it does fascinate me. I like the personal aspect too, but the societal aspect is really fascinating. Look at Western Europe, look at the Scandinavian countries, look at Japan, look at Singapore, these kind of places with ultra low fertility. What you see is that their average age, it climbs steadily year by year by year. And there's a point at which the average age of the citizens of that country crosses the point where fertility is done for adults. Once you get to that point, there's literally nothing you could do as a nation to prevent yourself from expiring. These are nations in decline. They're nations that are dying slowly, like, spent stars. And that was what we're really flirting with. Should we view that as a bad thing? I don't know. I guess that's a worldview question. Would it be good or bad if America just sort of expired from the earth by aging out? But there's human consequences to this too, John. There was a documentary that we mentioned in that breakpoint about Japan. It's this half-hour documentary on YouTube, and it's just jarring. It's called Dying Alone. And it's about all the people in Japan who literally get to the end of their lives and they've got no one. Nobody is there to look after them. Nobody cares about them. Nobody has any connection to them. And they'll just wind up, somebody will find them, and not to be crass here, but somebody will find them because there's a bad smell in the apartment complex. It's that ugly. That's not the picture of a healthy society. That's the picture of a dying one. And it starts really ultimately with, choices that individuals make about whether to invest in the future or whether to just invest in the now.
Yeah. And you can see, even with that question about aging, that documentary is stunning. And of course, we also talked, over the last couple of years about this trend where in Japan, where older widows are stealing so that they can go to prison, so that they can have somebody to talk to. It's heartbreaking, right? And when you think about this in light of COVID and our the fact that we're dealing with an aging population and we're dealing with a particularly vulnerable population because of this condition or this pandemic, things become normal. And this is what strikes me about this story about the baby bust, is that you would think it would be completely different, and what you're going to get is a new normal that we didn't know was normal until it's normal. And that's such a powerful part of culture. And if I could loop it back around to our first topic, which was all about politics and all about the election, like so much, and just the point that I made earlier, which is we are a culture in which so many decisions are made politically, that in and of itself reflects some pre-political realities that had to take place. Politics is not that important comparatively in a culture where you have strong, robust, big families, because people are governing themselves. And when people are governing themselves, they don't need somebody to either solve all their problems or take care of, everything that ails them or whatever. Politics is not that important. in a society where there is a strong, robust presence of the church, where people are looking after each other. You don't have the hard challenges and the hard questions of, does this person live or die, because of flat out economic realities like we see in so many other places in the world. In places where the norm is for people to be in families, and the norm is to be cared for by families, and where age is itself respected, because of wisdom, and because you actually see your job as an older human being to catechize and pass on values to the younger generation. And I said all this is connected. It doesn't seem connected, but it absolutely is connected.
That's objectively beautiful, isn't it? A society where we take care of each other, where each generation, in their weakest time, whether it's infancy or old age, will take care of the other, and they trade off in that role. It's like an organic continuation of human life and love. That's what it means to love your neighbor. And that is one of the key insights of this whole worldview thing. It's why I love Abraham Kuyper's stuff. It's a great reminder that not everything is about politics. You live in a ruthless society if it's one where every question is a political question. You need these other institutions that God designed, that he put into creation to govern human relations in order to have a humane and civil society. You need the family. You need strong families. You need a strong church. You need a strong academy. You need an education, an institution to educate the next generation. You need voluntary associations, things like the Boy Scouts, which is so tragically going down in flames right now. We're witnessing right now this concentration of all concern and power into politics, and then a couple other places like social media, at the expense of these ancient, venerable institutions that, keep us human. And that's why it's so important for Christians to really understand and believe that God created other institutions to govern creation, through which we take dominion and by which we take care of each other.
Yeah, and this is a great self-evaluation time for Christians. Is the uncertainty of this political season that seems like it's been going on forever, and the reason is because it's been going on forever. Is this stealing my hope? Is it stealing my joy? A couple weeks ago, I had on the Breakpoint podcast Anthony Bradley, and he made this statement. I said, "What is the key thing that fathers should bring to their kids?" And he said, "Joy." And I don't know that I'd answer that question the same way, but I would definitely had never thought of an essential thing that I'm supposed to bring to the life of my kids: joy. And this is a pre-political reality. This is something that can be the case. Reading the second half of Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, when they're literally living in a hard totalitarianism, and listening to this one family, or reading how this one family venerated their father for what their father brought to their lives: knowledge, courage, and yes, joy. In the midst of the chaos, way more uncertainty than we have right now. It's just a point of self-critique. It's a point for us to look. Not that nothing nefarious has happened, not that there's not real breaks in our culture that need to be addressed in a political level, but we need to strengthen what's pre-political in our lives and in our families and in our communities. And the church is the only game in town that can do this. There's not another group of the citizenry that has that same grounding to value family and to value community like the church. So this is a wonderful time of mission for us to point people to something way more stable than what we're losing our minds over right now.
And I'll say amen to that. We've got to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. There's one more story we want to hit here, John. It's one you sent to me just before the start of the program. We don't normally do stock market related stuff. We're not a financial analysis or advice show, but NASDAQ caught the headlines late this week by advancing a diversity directive of sorts through, or proposing one rather, for listing requirements. If you're a company that wants to list with NASDAQ, you're going to have to prove now, and if the Security and Exchange Commission approves this, you're going to have to show that you have a diverse board of directors, that you meet a quota of men and women, of minorities, of LGBTQ individuals. Although if you're a foreign company, apparently you can skip the second requirement and just use women because, well, I mean, in countries like Saudi Arabia, you're going to have a little bit of trouble finding publicly out LGBTQ individuals. But yeah, this is probably one of those moments where the new sexual orthodoxies and the new ideas about diversity and inclusion are being enshrined at a really high and official level if this goes through. So talk us through what your thoughts were on this, John, because this is an interesting moment in the corporate world.
Well, there was this line in a book by a guy named Todd Gitlin who wrote a history of the 60s from a liberal perspective. And he wrote, after the 60s, the right marched on the White House and the left marched on the English departments. And, you fast forward 20 years and both got what they had aimed at. And now you kind of look at who's got all the power centers. And this is a way to look at it, is these kind of different segments of culture. You've got the political government sphere, you've got the church sphere, the family sphere, you've got arts and entertainment and education and so on. And we know that this ideology, the LGBTQ ideology, had gained a lot of ground through the entertainment, through the arts, through education. But what we have seen in terms of woke capitalism, what we've seen in terms of the normalization of lifestyle choices, of violations of observable biological realities, things that are just as clearly part of the human experience as gravity, can only be done when there's kind of a financial lever behind it. And that's one of the interesting things to see this with NASDAQ. One of the things I found interesting about this is of course, so many companies in the NASDAQ. NASDAQ is the technology group of companies, right, of the market, and so many of these companies, of course, are from China. And to hear the NASDAQ claim that we're going to force compliance on China, this is one of there were two things about this that were really interesting. This is one of them. Is this where corporate America is going to stand up to China? Like, the NBA is not going to stand up on this. We're not going to talk about, the Chinese communist officials taking the hair of persecuted Uyghur women in concentration camps and selling them as beauty products. But this is where we're going to draw the line. You have to have, either a woman and an LGBTQ member of that community on.
It's like that one meme where Squidward is sleeping when all the bad things happen, and then finally something mundane relatively happens, and his eyes shoot open, and they're all bloodshot, and he's angry. Sorry,
this is the one. Is that was
a very
SpongeBob
millennial thing
reference?
Yeah, no, it's a popular meme. I mean, you'll see it all over the place. If you're running the
for the record, Shane just dropped SpongeBob. I had nothing to do with that. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was that they have this new guideline for companies to be part of the NASDAQ says that you have to have a woman on your board and someone who's part of the LGBTQ community. Now, you can see also how this stuff gets normalized. So to put those two requirements in the same, what does that assume? What's baseline assumed by all of that? Is that
the people in the LGBTQ category are the same sort of person as a woman. There's an intrinsic quality to this. This is a biological or inborn thing.
Right. And what a great thing to talk to kids about. Just say, what's being assumed right here? Because C.S. Lewis said the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones argued and the ones that are assumed, but the ones that are assumed. But the other thing that I found to be really interesting is many people probably heard of a story this week about the girl who starred in Juno, the woman who starred in Juno, that movie, which is a very interesting and very pro-life movie from a decade or more ago. A woman named Ellen Page, who's actually a very talented actress, has just announced that she is Elliot Page after having announced that she was a lesbian a couple years ago and lives in a gay marriage, has now announced that she actually identifies as a male. And that assumption of that being a woman and being a member of the LGBT community are really the same thing. We're talking about the same sort of quality in a human, is revealed to be foolish or revealed to be not true by this story about Ellen Page announcing that she's now Elliot Page, right? So let's say that you meet compliance by putting Elliot Page on your board. And then Elliot Page then now becomes, or Ellen Page becomes Elliot Page. Are you now out of compliance?
Yeah. Well, it's hard. These sorts of reductios work because it's really hard to, when your stance is fundamentally irrational, it's really hard to make rational sense out of it, to make it sound good. Like I saw one joke that wasn't really a joke that said, it was really awful of whatever studio created Juno to cast a white male in the role of a pregnant woman. That was just, very backward of them.
So years ago, I used to teach on postmodernism to students, and I would use a building that is on the campus of Ohio State University. It's called the Wexner Center. It was the first postmodern building. It was supposed to be.
Yes.
You remember this story?
That one. That one's
nuts.
It's
a great picture. I've been there. It's a fascinating place. I toured through it with a group of students. You start going up staircases that go nowhere.
I love this story.
And the floor is all crooked and all that sort of stuff. And I remember. Hearing somebody, another apologist, talk about this building, and I used to talk about it because I'd been through it, and it was such a great illustration, and I'd have pictures of it, and this other apologist would say something along the lines of, you can't have a building with a beam that doesn't go all the way to the floor, which is one of the features of the, it's got this kind of big column, but it doesn't go all the way to the floor, it doesn't go all the way to the ceiling or a cross beam. But you can't have that unless you actually have beams that go all the way to the floor, right?
Yeah.
You can't have a staircase that goes nowhere if you actually want to have a building where you can get to the second floor. And that's what I thought of when I heard this whole conversation about the NASDAQ, is that you have to be pretty far down the whole to use Ross Douthat's word about our culture, decadent, down kind of the rabbit hole of decadence, where you can actually have this conversation and where you can actually feasibly create the sort of dilemma that we talked about with Ellen Page becoming Elliot Page, suddenly moving a company from being in compliance to these new NASDAQ regulations to not being in compliance. In other words, you can only doubt gravity in a world in which you're relying on gravity. I mean, there's just this this lie that is put to these to this way of thinking by these illustrations. There's just a decadence that we're able to have these conversations and try to fight for this level of equality that doesn't actually that reveals kind of how far down the rabbit hole we are and how much we're actually reliant on biological realities in order to question biological realities.
Here's a fun monkey wrench that I didn't even think about until I read Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds, and I've mentioned this a bunch before, but it's a really cool book. But he talks about how there may be a zero-sum game going on with diversity and inclusion, because it turns out there's studies that demonstrate this. It turns out as soon as you create some sort of diversity quota in student admissions or boards of directors or things like that, what you do is you take equality away from the economic side of things and you give it to the sexual identity or gender side of things. So in other words, what happens is when you say, well, we have to have this many racial minorities, we have to have this many LGBTQ people, we have to have this many women, what you do is disenfranchise economically disadvantaged people in order to give it over to the rich and advantaged members of these quote-unquote minority groups. And the end result is actually that you give more power to people who are already privileged and powerful. Yeah. It was a really great insight. I'd never thought about that before, but it does sort of remind you that there's a way the world works, and it's not always possible to fight against that. Now, it's good to have, I think it's good to have diversity, certainly diversity of men and women, certainly racial diversity, but I don't think it can be forced in exactly the way we're trying to do it right now as a society.
Well, and it certainly doesn't extend to non-biological or
right.
realistic categories.
Yeah, because I don't equate those two like
right.
Everyone does
it's just
today.
when you equate something unchosen, immutable characteristic with really something that is chosen. And I don't mean chosen in the sense like I could stop anytime I want, as if there's not like a deep-seated, inherent, maybe even genetic source for same-sex attractions or gender identity confusions. But to actually reorient the world around those things and therefore use those things to say that there's not a norm, there's not a reality that you're dealing with. That is a choice. That's a set of choices. It's a set of choices not only made by an individual who transitions or who enters a relationship. It's made by a society over and over and over to deny what's right in front of our face. And you just can't get there from here.
Yeah, a lot of interesting observations to draw from there. So I think it's time now for our recommendations. And this is always a great segment because if we've had a downer day on the news front, we can always talk about cool stuff that we want people to check out. So I'll go first with a recommendation for reading The Christmas Carol, or A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I know that there are a million different adaptations out there on film, and many of them are great, and I love quite a few of them. My two favorites are The Muppets Christmas Carol, and there's a lot of old good ones, but one really good one is the Robert Zemeckis, Jim Carrey one from a few years back.
It really
that's
is,
computer
yeah.
animated. Yeah, it's almost verbatim Dickens, but I recommend reading the book. Because it is absolutely masterful. Dickens he's one of the great Jedi masters of the English language. He could turn a phrase like nobody else. He introduced personification and just these amazing turns of phrase and figures of speech into every line that he wrote. There's this one great line where he talks about the potatoes in the pot at the Cratchit's house, banging on the lid to be let out. It's it's just such great writing. And there's scenes also in the book. It's not a big book. It's basically a novella. There's scenes in there that seldom make it into a lot of these adaptations. One of them is where Scrooge is taken to see his former love, who he sacrificed for monetary gain, for his golden idol. And she's happy and she's married with kids, and he is, he's alone and all by himself in his cold, dark mansion. Another scene is the ignorance and want scene at the end of the second Ghost, the Ghost of Christmas
That one gets
present.
left out way too much.
Oh, it gets left out because no one understands what it means. It's just such a confusing and weird scene. But these two kids, ignorance and want, they're symbols that Dickens put in there. They're climbing out or peeping out from underneath the ghost's robe, and Scrooge asks about him, and he's terrified by him. And it's just a picture of how I love what they. I forget exactly how Dickens describes them. So I should take my own advice and reread it. But in the Zemeckis version, it's so powerful because the ghost throws Scrooge's own words back in his face, where he says, Scrooge's like, whose are they? And do they have nowhere to go? And he goes, they are a man's. And he's like, Scrooge's like, is there no help for them? And he says, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And that's exactly what Scrooge had said earlier. And when he says that in the movie version, the little girl turns into a prostitute, and the little boy turns into a murderer, and gets thrown behind bars. And it's to me, it's Dickens' picture of how neglect and evil begets violence and neglect and evil, and it's just like an endless vicious cycle. And Scrooge is being invited to break it. And I would say also A Christmas Carol is really the gospel. Like if you read Dickens' presentation of it in there, Dickens was kind of an odd figure, not necessarily what we'd consider a traditional Christian in many respects, but he had a deep understanding of this. It's a picture of undeserved grace, unbending a man away from himself and back out toward others, teaching him again how to love. And that's the central point of it, is that it's never too late for that to happen to you. It can happen right at the end of your life, and you can sponge out the writing on the tombstone of your indolent, useless, and greedy life, and remake it and be a benefactor and a savior and a beloved, father figure, as he becomes when he gets a second chance. So read A Christmas Carol with your family. It's super fun, and if you want to, throw a scene with Gonzo in there or two, then feel free to do that, because I might too.
Well, my wife reads that with our kids every year. They're reading it right now, and I love to sit in on it when I can. It is definitely a great recommendation. I would also say that I would recommend the Muppets Christmas Carol too. That's part of our tradition that we do. But when you do it, watch all the scenes like watch all not behind the scenes, but off camera stuff.
Right.
There's some really, really, really funny stuff that happens. Like the choir of little kind of faceless boys that are singing, and then they get in a fight. If you've never seen the fight between those two, where one of them bops the other one, and his head literally dents in. It's one of the funniest things. My kids now actually probably no longer even notice the real story. They're just looking for all the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, like the one
happening.
with the lady who's beating the cat. I mean, she's just like got it by its tail and she's beating it against the doorstep or something. They're all
There's
Muppets.
some bizarre stuff back there, and just like it goes unlooked for.
Thank you, Jim Henson.
Yeah, there we go. I will say my recommendation this week is really simple. It's a great joy that I have missed. It took me about a month to get over the fact last year, somewhere around March, the cancellation of all sports, especially March Madness. And college basketball is back, and it is a lot of fun to watch. It's not nearly as politically loaded as so many of the other professional sports have been, which I appreciate. And you just kind of see the purity of the game. If you're a basketball guy like me, it's fantastic. Specifically, having watched Gonzaga play and Baylor play just last night, those are two teams that I would say, if you loved hoops, man, they're tough. They are going to have they're both going to have great seasons, and sparing any kind of huge injuries, which Gonzaga just dodged a bullet the other night with their incredible freshman point guard. That might be the national championship game come March, which I know the season's going to look different. There's fewer games. There's less fans in the stands. There's still kind of mini bubbles being created everywhere and all that sort of stuff. But you get to see guys who really love to play and the purity of it. And it's also a really good era right now for coaches. They just coach differently, and there's something about realizing the sort of people that they're coaching. I'm thinking of Mark Few at Gonzaga in particular, and Scott Drew, who's had to rebuild a program that was in shambles at Baylor, and what's happening there. These are people that you kind of smell some Christian faith behind the scenes here, and I'm wondering. I definitely think that's the case with the Drew family. And Scott now being at Baylor, and Bryce Drew now being at Grand Canyon University. There's just a lot of fun stuff happening. So that's my self-serving. I haven't been able to talk about basketball for a year. I've watched some games this week, and excited. It's going to be a good season.
I like what you said there, John, about the purity of just enjoying the sport. It reminded me of what Eric Liddell says about how when he runs, he feels God's pleasure. It's there's something very good in that. There's something very human in that. It reminds me of, I'll get my C.S. Lewis reference in here. It's not necessarily virtuous to enjoy a hobby or a sport, but Screwtape says there's an innocence and self-forgetfulness about it that I don't trust at all. And so he's counseling Wormwood to keep his human patient from doing these sorts of things. So that's cool. I like the way you phrased that.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, and listeners know that I'm an addict to college basketball, and it was hard to imagine not having March Madness last year, and it's just been fun to see some of these games, watch them with my kids too.
Yeah. Well, folks, that's it for today. Visit breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories that we've mentioned today on the program, as well as a wealth of always fresh resources to help you live and think like a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.